Welcome to Crime Scene X. Today's video will cover 3 true horror stories about babysitting. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like, comment what you think, and subscribe for daily uploads. Sit back and enjoy the video. I'd been babysitting for the Johnsons for nearly a year, watching their 4-year-old Emma every other weekend. Mrs. Johnson always joked that I was more responsible than half the adults she knew. I took it as a compliment. Tonight, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were off to some charity event and wouldn't be back until late. Emma was already in her PJs, eagerly showing me her latest drawing, a house with a family standing in front, your typical kid's artwork. "Is that your house?" I asked, pointing to the drawing. Emma nodded, grinning. "And that's Mommy, Daddy, and me. What about the other person next to you?" "That's my friend Danny. He comes over to play sometimes." I thought little of it. Imaginary friends are part of childhood, after all. After tucking her into bed and reading a bedtime story, I settled on the couch, scrolling through my phone. Hours ticked by, and I got lost in the world of social media, funny videos, and gossip sites. My eyelids grew heavy, and I caught myself nodding off a couple of times. I was about to give in to the temptation of sleep when I heard it, a soft creak coming from upstairs. Figuring Emma might have woken up to use the bathroom, I decided to check on her. When I pushed open her bedroom door, it was pitch black, the nightlight unplugged. "Emma?" I whispered, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. When the room lit up, I found Emma sitting on her bed facing the wall. "Sweetie, are you okay?" She turned around, her eyes half closed as if she were sleepwalking. "Danny wanted to play," she murmured. "Okay, let's get you back to bed," I said, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling rising within me. As I tucked her back in, I asked, "Where's Danny now?" Emma pointed towards her closet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sleep now, okay?" I kissed her forehead and plugged the nightlight back in. I returned to the living room, but couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. A couple of hours later, I heard another sound. This time, it was the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps moved towards the staircase, pausing occasionally, as if considering their next move. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could Mr. and Mrs. Johnson have come home early without telling me? I checked my phone. No missed calls or messages. Gathering my courage, I crept towards the kitchen. The room was empty. I flicked on the lights, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to chastise myself for being paranoid, I noticed it. The sliding door that led to the backyard was ajar. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed to lock the door and then raced upstairs to check on Emma. She was still there, sleeping peacefully. I called the police and kept an eye on Emma's room until they arrived. They found no one but suggested that someone could have easily entered and exited without leaving much trace. They advised me to keep all doors and windows locked and left an officer to patrol the area. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson came home to a whirlwind of explanations and apologies. They were concerned but thankful that Emma was safe. A few days later, Mrs. Johnson called me. The security footage had been reviewed, and they'd found something, or rather, someone. A figure had been caught on camera, lurking around the property before entering through the sliding door. I was horrified. All those times I'd thought I was alone with Emma, there might have been someone else, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Mrs. Johnson paused before saying, "We also found something else on the tape." Before entering, the person stood outside Emma's window. She waved at him, and then he waved back before moving towards the door. My heart froze. Emma called him Danny. It was my first time babysitting for the Smith family. They had just moved into the neighborhood and needed someone to watch their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, and their 8-year-old son, Tim, for the evening. They were a cheerful bunch, eager to meet their new neighbors and integrate into the community. After Mrs. Smith showed me around the house and briefed me on bedtime routines, they departed for their dinner party, leaving me in charge. Emily and Tim were well-behaved kids. We played board games, watched a bit of TV, and I made them some dinner. As the sky outside darkened, I prepared them for bed. Teeth brushed, faces washed, and pajamas on, I led them to their respective bedrooms. "Can you check for monsters?" Emily asked with a shaky voice as I tucked her in. I smiled, playing along. Of course. I opened the closet, looked under the bed, and even checked behind the curtains. All clear, I declared. Satisfied, Emily closed her eyes. I kissed her goodnight and shut the door softly behind me. I headed downstairs to tidy up the kitchen. That's when I noticed it. The basement door was open, just a crack, but I was certain it had been closed earlier. I approached cautiously, wondering if I should call the Smiths or the police. But then I rationalized. It was probably just Tim sneaking down to grab a toy or something. I decided to check it out myself. I opened the door fully and flicked on the light switch. Peering down, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I descended the stairs, my footsteps muffled by the old carpet that covered them. The basement was mostly unfinished, but well organized, filled with boxes labeled kitchen, photos, clothes, and so on. Everything seemed in its place. Feeling a bit silly, I turned to leave. That's when a box labeled toys caught my eye. The tape sealing it had been freshly cut. Curious, I opened the box. Inside were various toys, some old and some new. But what caught my eye was a walkie-talkie, identical to the one I'd seen Tim playing with earlier. Just as I was about to replace the lid, the walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Tim, come in. Are you there?" My heart skipped a beat. The voice didn't belong to Tim. It was an adult man's voice, deep and raspy. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and returned upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. Rushing to Tim's room, I found him sound asleep. His own walkie-talkie was on his nightstand, switched off. I called the police immediately, and then the Smiths. Within minutes, officers arrived to sweep the house and yard. The Smiths arrived shortly after, their faces flushed from worry and confusion. The police found nobody but were concerned enough to launch an investigation. Mrs. Smith was puzzled about the basement box. She swore it had been sealed since they moved. "Maybe it was a previous homeowner's or something left behind," she murmured. Weeks later, the police identified fingerprints on the walkie-talkie that didn't belong to any family member or me. They never found the person attached to those prints or the voice that had come through the walkie-talkie that night. Though I continued to babysit in the neighborhood, I couldn't bring myself to return to the Smiths' home. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had spoken through that walkie-talkie knew the layout of the house, knew about the box of toys in the basement, and most disturbingly, knew that Tim would be listening. I still babysit, but I can't help but double-check all the doors and windows these days, especially when I'm looking after kids who like to use walkie-talkies. I had babysat for the Thompsons for months without incident. Their 8-year-old son, Max, was a delight, eager to show off his latest Lego creation or talk about his favorite dinosaurs. Tonight was no different, at least initially. Mrs. Thompson left the usual list on the kitchen counter: emergency numbers, bedtime, the Wi-Fi password. "He's been a little under the weather lately," she mentioned, "so he might be more subdued than usual." After the Thompsons left, Max and I settled into the living room to play video games. Eventually, I noticed Max seemed distracted, pausing the game frequently to look out the window. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. It was weird, but kids are weird sometimes, right? Eventually, it was bedtime. I made sure he brushed his teeth and tucked him into bed. "Good night, buddy," I said, turning off the light. "Wait," Max looked up at me, his eyes a little too intense for an 8-year-old. "Can you make sure to lock all the doors and windows? And maybe check the backyard?" Sure," I said, puzzled by his request. I did as he asked, securing the house before settling down on the couch to do some homework. It was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling, or at least, that's what I told myself. About an hour later, I heard a noise, a soft thud from upstairs. Max probably needed water or had to use the bathroom. I waited a moment to see if he would call for me. When he didn't, I decided to check on him. His room was empty. "Max?" I checked the bathroom, the other bedrooms, even the closets. No sign of him. I was about to grab my phone and call the Thompsons when I noticed the sliding door to the backyard was open. Just a crack, but definitely open. My heart sank. Against every instinct telling me not to, I stepped outside. And there was Max, sitting in the middle of the yard, staring at the back fence. "Max, what are you doing? You scared me." He turned to me, his face pale. I needed to make sure. Make sure of what? I was trying to keep my voice steady, but fear made it quiver. That he's gone. Who's gone, Max? The man who watches me from the fence. I see him some nights. That's why I wanted everything locked. There was no one there now, just a dark yard and the imposing line of a wooden fence. I took Max's hand and led him back inside, locking the door behind us. When his parents got home, I told them everything. Mr. Thompson did a thorough check of the property, while Mrs. Thompson comforted Max. Later, they called me aside. "We found some cigarette butts by the fence in the back," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tinged with fear. "We're going to file a police report. I don't know what to say except thank you for looking after Max. We'll be installing security cameras first thing tomorrow." I nodded, still shaken. "I'm glad I could help, but I think you should find another babysitter. I can't come back." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I understand. You did more than we could have ever asked for." I left their house, relieved to be out of there but haunted by what could have happened. It wasn't supernatural, but the real world could be just as frightening. Max saw something he couldn't explain, something adults would brush off as childhood imagination. Except this time, it wasn't. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please like the video, comment what you thought, and subscribe for daily uploads.